got a decent amount to get through today, so we'll go ahead and get started. Kind of sum up where we were last week. We went over the story of David and Goliath, which we're all fairly familiar with, and so that kind of sets the stage for what happens next. Any questions from last week you've been pondering over? Good. Excellent. All right. So, we've already prayed, so let's just dive in. So we're in chapter 18 of 1 Samuel. I'm going to skip the first couple of verses because it's, as I said last week, I think, this lesson and next lesson, some of it's kind of interwoven. Today we're going to kind of focus on David and Saul, that kind of relationship early on. And then next week we're going to look at David and Jonathan and how those kind of intersect and are woven together. So we're kind of skip over some stuff, and I'll, just so we kind of have the time frame that makes sense, and then I'll fill in what happens with Jonathan next week. So we're going to skip the first 5 verses to verse 6 of chapter 18. As they, so this is the army of Israel, gathered folks, right? As they were coming home, when David returned from killing the Philistine, the women came out of all the towns of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they made merry, "Saul has killed his thousands." Yes. "And David has killed his 10,000s. How do you think that's going to go over?
Not good.
Not well. We're, especially in this section, we're really going to see, 1 Samuel really sets up this dichotomy between Saul and David. So we're going to see this sort of, initially, Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. Why is that? Obviously there's going to be an issue with Saul, right? But why might they be saying something like this?
They liking him?
Yeah.
They're liking him more, right? But also, there was, in the bits that I skipped over, I believe there's a little bit saying that David is now being kind of sent out on missions. And he is being very successful. Why is he being successful?
The Lord is with him.
The Lord is with him, right? That's the important bit, right? So not only is he being more successful, but that's actually just an outcropping of this idea that the Lord is with him, and by implication, and in fact, who is the Lord not with?
Saul.
Saul. So, part of his jealousy is just that he's jealous, but part of his jealousy is also this fact that he knows that David now has God's Spirit. He doesn't. So that's part of it as well. Saul was very angry, for this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed 1,000. What more can he have than but the kingdom?" So Saul eyed David from that day on. So he's just kind of keeping an eye on him, watching him. The other reason why they might ascribe to David more than Saul is what happened in the story that we just went over, David and Goliath.
Why?
He was
Well,
successful over the giant.
Yeah.
David is successful over the giant. Saul is not.
Who was the head of that whole? Maybe there
Saul.
were 10,000. No, I'm talking about Goliath.
Okay.
He was the big 5-star general.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know.
Maybe not
There weren't that
the
many,
general,
though.
but
There weren't
certainly
that
the probably not that many. No, it's hyperbolic, certainly.
Right, gotcha.
But you remember, how long was Saul and the army there while Goliath taunted them?
40 days.
40 days.
And David
So
just
again-
shows up.
Yeah. So then again, Saul had ample opportunity to take care of this, but he did not. Right? So that's part of this jealousy. And David shows up same day. He's like, "Oh yeah, I'll take him on. That's fine." He hears him in the morning, and then he goes fights him in the evening. Right? All right. The next day, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul. Okay, now we've heard this idea that an evil spirit taunts him. I've said before, I think today we would probably say he was maybe schizophrenic, maybe bipolar.
Certainly, he was very depressed.
Certainly, yeah, severe depression, right? He had definite manic moments, and that we'll see in a little bit, right? But just because we would look at it and say, oh, he has schizophrenia, and they look at it and they say, oh, he has an evil spirit, I think there's some overlap there, right? Because I think there's some definite spiritual aspects to mental illness and vice versa. So don't assume that they say he has an evil spirit. Oh, well, that's just kind of a bunch of superstition, or we now know what it is. Yeah, but anyways. And you notice, what is the adjective that's used for how that, no, it's a verb. What's the verb used for that spirit? How does the evil spirit come upon Saul?
It says from God, and that puzzles me.
Okay, that's a good one. Okay, let's start with rushed, because that's where I started. Rushed. So remember, when David was anointed, how did the Spirit of God come
Same
upon
way.
him? Rushed, right? So it's the same. So we're seeing this parallel, but it's an opposite. Now it's this evil spirit from God.
So these sent being spirit, I really see that's kind of disturbing.
Right.
Did he send it, or did he permit it to be sent?
I think the understanding is a little bit more the permitting. It's, remember the book of Job, right? Beginning of the book of Job, the accuser, Satan, he comes before God, by God's permission, into his court. He says, hey, think about your servant Job. I think that he's only cool because you've protected him. Let me go mess with him, right? And God says, okay, I will allow you to do that. So it's absolutely under God's control. He's not allowing it to go any further. He gives Satan some very strict bounds. Okay, you can take all his stuff, but you cannot hurt him. You cannot kill him. You can even give him swords and all that sort of stuff. But it's all within God's control and under God's partially direction, right? Why would God allow this evil spirit to come upon Saul?
Part of his plan.
Part of his plan, right. So part of it is beyond our pay grade, right? But we might extrapolate from what we've seen before. God has certainly allowed his people to suffer many times.
Think about Solomon and Gomorrah. That's a little worse than every
Right.
evil spirit.
Yeah, exactly.
God.
Right. So there could be pure destruction, but throughout Judges really is kind of the preamble for the 1st and 2nd Samuel. Over and over and over, the people learn. They turn from God, right? God allows something bad to happen to them, and an opposing army to come and oppress them, sometimes for years, decades. And the reason for that is so that they say, eventually, oh Yahweh, we've turned from worshiping you, please save us, because these other gods don't do anything for us. And then they're allowed to kind of come back, right? So maybe that's part of it. Maybe God is allowing Saul to be tormented by this evil spirit so that he wises up and says, hey, I've rejected God's spirit, so maybe I should, bring it back. Maybe it's that sort of thing. Maybe it's just to allow, we'll see eventually this sets him down on a path that he's already been going, but he continues on this path where he's on a downhill slope and David's on the rise, because everybody knows that Saul's nuts, right? To a certain extent. So this evil spirit comes from God, and it's a very strong understanding of God's providence, God's sovereignty. God is in control of everything, right? There may be other gods from these other nations. There may be all of these other nations that are opposing. There may be these evil spirits. God's in charge of all of them. We're not just talking the God who is maybe slightly more powerful than these other gods. We're not talking the God that they happen to worship. We're talking the God who is sovereign over all things. So if something happens, God's is allowing it. Right? So I think that's the reason why it's an evil spirit from God. Right? God's allowing this to happen. It's part of His plan, part of which we don't understand, but part of which we can kind of figure out. Does that make sense? It still may be unsettling, and that's okay. It's okay to be unsettled and mystified by the works of God, because we're teeny, and He has a much bigger plan and a much bigger sort of purpose behind all of this. So this evil spirit from God rushes upon Saul, and he raved within his house. Or some other translations say that he prophesied, which is interesting. While David was playing the lyre, remember David has had this role where he plays music when Saul is in these moods to kind of alleviate. As he did day by day, Saul had his spear in his hand. Why they allowed him to have the spear in his hand in this state, I don't know. And Saul threw the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Spry young man, which probably infuriates Saul even more. Saul was afraid of David because Yahweh was with him, but had departed from Saul. So there we have, this is why Saul was afraid. Because the Spirit of the Lord had left him, it went to David, and he's seeing everybody loves David, everybody's fed up with me, right? So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And David marched out and came in leading the army. David had success in all his undertakings, for Yahweh was with him. When Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for it was he who marched out and came in. So, in an effort to kind of get rid of David, Saul makes him a general. And he's leading 1,000 men all over the nation, right, on various missions. Beating back the Amalekites and the Philistines and all of these other tribes, right? And so, what Saul is trying to do to get rid of David is actually exacerbating the problem, because the people are now seeing David as their leader, as David as their savior, not in a sort of spiritual way, but in a real, actual way. Those raiders from the north were attacking us, and then David and his men came and defeated them, right? So David is starting to get this great, everybody's loving him because he's doing all of these things on behalf of the nation. In many ways, he's taking on this role that the king should be doing. The king, especially in this day, he was the guy who was in the front of the ranks, leading the men into the charge. He was, we're talking Lord of the Rings, Braveheart, that standing out there in front of the men and saying, this is what we're doing. There may be a day when our hearts will fail and all this stuff, but today is not that day, that sort of stuff, right? This is not the general who's like up on the hill and saying, okay, go there, go there. The kings were out in the front. They were very visible. And David is taking on that role, right? During this time, again, he's not king yet, but he's learning leadership. He's learning sort of that military leadership, tactics. He's learning how to deal with 1,000 men, most of which are probably older than he is, right? He's earning their respect. He's fighting with them. He's showing his way. So he's learning and he's growing. He's gaining those skills that he will need eventually.
Aaron, how old, give or take, was he at this point in his life?
Probably like late teens, maybe early 20s. Because he was a young man, but a young man is like 14 when he fought Goliath, and this is probably in the next several years. So he's, by our scale, not very old. Now, we also remember that people lived 30s, maybe 40s. So, you know, in today's numbers, he would probably be not quite middle aged. He's still young, but probably 20s, 30s.
Yeah.
Kind of. Right. He's still pretty.
Not someone today we would consider to be kingly.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. It would be someone who most people would look at him and go, "It's just a kid. What are you talking about?" Right? He can't lead us, and so he's earning that respect among these soldiers, right? These guys who are and civilian soldiers as well. So they're not even, they didn't say, hey, I'm going to become part of the army, and yet whoever you put over me, you're going to put over me. These are, you know, blacksmiths and farmers, and they have their own lives, and they say, oh yes, I will serve my country in this way, and they go and they see this, you know, little kid, and, or not, you know, not actually a little kid, but this young man, right? And he attains their respect, right? He leads them around. And he's doing well. Everything he does well. We've heard this lots of different times in Scripture, right? Because the Lord is with him. I read all that. All right. Oh, also another thing to note, all Israel and Judah loved David. At this point, there is still, partially from the aspect, or from the perspective of the writer, but during the time, there is a north and south kind of understanding. There is Judah, and there is Israel. There are, it's, you know, mostly Judah and Benjamin, Dan, a little bit, the folks in the south, and then there are the other guys, right? And there's very much this sort of divide between the two, which becomes more palpable further on in this story. Then Saul said to David, here is my elder daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight Yahweh's battles. So this is Saul's next act, right? Become part of the family, right? Now remember, he's already offered this. He should have already given his daughter's hand in marriage for defeating Goliath, but he hadn't done that yet. So now he's doing it. For Saul thought, I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines deal with him. So go and be valiant. Go and do great stuff, and you can get my daughter's hand in marriage. Go risk. Go put yourself out there. So he's going to be defeated. David said to Saul, who am I, and who are my kinsfolk, my family's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? So, again, you see David's humility. He's saying, I'm nobody. Yeah, I killed a giant, I've done these things for you, but I don't deserve to be a part of the royal family. But at the time when Saul's daughter, Merab, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Meholathite as a wife. So Saul, after promising this daughter, goes and marries her to somebody else. A Mehethalite, which is another tribe, so probably this was a lot of the foreign statecraft type stuff was, here, marry my daughter. So my daughter is in your palace, so I'm probably not going to attack you. We have this connection, so it's kind of a peaceful type thing. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David. Saul was told, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him as she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, see, the king is delighted with you, and all his servants love you. Now then become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants reported these words to David in private. And David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man of no repute? The servants of Saul told him, this is what David said. Then Saul said, Thus shall you say to David, the king desires no marriage present except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged on the king's enemies. Okay. That is not a delightful thing to go get, right? Do you think the Philistines are going to be pleased with this idea that he's going to come and get 100 foreskins from them? No. The whole purpose of this is, Saul is saying, well, I've sent him after the Philistines, and he keeps defeating them. Maybe the Philistines don't have quite enough,
Manliness?
not manliness, no, but it's
Anger and fear.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. So
Need a little
it's
more incentive.
yeah, they need some more incentive to kill this guy. So I'm gonna send the punk upstart kid down to them, and it's going to be very clear. Hey, Philistines, we're after your foreskins. Right? Not pleasant. Right? That's going to make you fight pretty hard. Because that's not only, we're probably all going to die. But if we don't die, it's going to be painful. And humiliating. That's the big thing. It's humiliating. Not only to the army that has been defeated, but to the entire Philistine nation. This is going to enrage all of them. Right? So this is what Saul's tactic is. It's pretty obvious at this point. Right? Go do this ridiculous, difficult task. Thus shall you say to David, yeah, okay. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines, no doubt. When his servants told David these words, David was well pleased to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David rose and went along with his men and killed 100 of the Philistines, and David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king. So the idea here is that they have a bag, and they lay it out, and they count them out right in front of the king and say, hey, here you go. This is a lovely thing. Yeah. And there is the translation that I read last night from NIV said that he gathered 200 actually.
They'll overkill.
Yeah. That he might become the king's son-in-law. Saul gave him his daughter Michal as a wife. But when Saul realized that Yahweh was with David and that Saul's daughter Michal loved him, Saul was still more afraid of David. So this backfired, right? Not only has he given him more honor and more prestige, he's also made him officially part of the royal family. So Saul was David's enemy from that time forward. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle. As often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his fame became very great. So the whole nation, knows very clearly that David is the guy who takes care of stuff, right? He's the one that does what they need him to do. I'm going to skip a bit. We got into chapter 19. And we're running out of time, so I might skip over some stuff. Again, there was war, and David went out to fight against the Philistines. He launched a heavy attack on them so that they fled before him. Then an evil spirit of Yahweh came upon Saul. So he sat in his house with his spear in his hands. While David was playing music, Saul sought to pin David to the wall with a spear, but he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall. David fled and escaped that night. Yes, we've heard that before. So maybe it happened twice. Maybe it's from another storyteller, and we're kind of editing them all together. But Saul sent messengers to David's house to keep watch over him, planning to kill him in the morning. David's wife, Michal, told him, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through the window. He fled away and escaped. Michal took an idol and laid it in the bed, and she put a net of goat's hair on its head and covered it with clothes. Then when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. Then Saul sent the messengers to see David for themselves. He said, bring him up to me in the bed that I may kill him. And the messengers came in, an idol was in the bed, with the coverings of goat's hair on his head. Saul said to Michal, "Why have you deceived me like this and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped?" Michal answered Saul, "He said to me, 'Let me go. Why should I kill you?'" So, Saul now openly is trying to kill David. Right? He sends rapscallions to watch his house. In the psalm that is attributed to David at this time in particular, twice he has this refrain that these men are like wild dogs running through the streets. Right? A pack of wild animals. Michal allows him to escape, covers his tracks. Think about what that means.
I love him a lot more than I love you, Daddy.
Yeah, right? She is.
Well, and she's putting
Saul's.
herself in danger
Yeah,
too.
Yeah,
she's putting herself in danger. But also now think of it with, not in a Western mindset, but a Middle Eastern mindset. Your first allegiance is to your family. And if you're the royal family, oh yes, that's your first allegiance. So her dad has, not directly, but indirectly said, keep him here because we're going to kill him. And she goes against her father's will and goes with her husband's and allows him to escape. In fact, it's her idea. Her cover is that he basically threatened her life and took off. Right? So she has protected herself from harm, but she has betrayed her father, which is a big thing, and will come up next week as well. Now David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah. So remember, they're down in Gibeon. He goes all the way up to Ramah, where Samuel went to retire because he said, "I'm done with kings. I'm done with all of this. Saul is a big jerk. I'm not gonna see him again ever." Right? He goes 80 miles away from Ramah. So David goes and joins him there.
Samuel's old.
Yeah, he's quite old.
Okay, so we were talking about how old David was. Samuel is up in age.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Because he can't see.
He's probably up towards that 40, 50
Okay.
in that range.
Mhm.
In today's standards, probably like 80s maybe.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, he's old. He's been around. He's done this a long time. He's pretty done with it. Now David fled and escaped. He came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. He and Samuel went and settled at Naioth. I didn't look that up. Somewhere. I'll find it later. Somewhere else. Saul was told David is at Naioth in Ramah. So it's near Ramah. Then Saul sent messengers to take David. When they saw the company of the prophets in a frenzy, with Samuel standing in charge of them, so there's all these prophets, and they're in this prophetic sort of mystical craziness, kind of Pentecostal service. Then the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also fell into a prophetic frenzy. When Saul was told, he sent other messengers, and they also fell into a frenzy. Saul sent messengers again a third time, and they also fell into a frenzy. So this is Samuel's defense. Is he's out here and he's leading his prophets. Remember, he's given up kings. He's training prophets. They're in this prophetic, like charismatic sort of. They're prophesying and they're I don't know, maybe barking like dogs. They're doing all sorts of things that you might think of.
Got a big tent.
Yeah, exactly. And so all of these people are being sent from Saul, and they get into this area and they start doing it too, right? And they're dancing around and they're taking off their clothes and they're doing all sorts of stuff, right? Then he himself, Saul, went to Ramah. He came to the great well that is at Seku. He asked, "Where is Samuel and David?" And someone said, "They are at Naioth in Ramah." He went there towards Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him. And as he was going, he fell into a prophetic frenzy until he came to Naioth at Ramah. He too stripped off his clothes, and he too fell into a frenzy before Samuel. He lay naked all that day and all that night. Therefore it is said, is Saul also among the prophets? So he tries to go and get Samuel and David, and he receives, maybe for the last time, I think, the Spirit of God and the spirit of prophetic frenzy. And Samuel and David just walk off. Interesting. We're going to skip over chapter 20, and I'm going to real quick. So another one that is really, this is a defining story, right? So David comes back down south. Saul is back in Gibeon. And David heads back down south because this is the area that he knows, right? If he's going to elude Saul, he needs to be in an area that he understands. And he goes to Nob, which I'm not sure where it is. What's important about Nob, northeast 2 miles of Jerusalem. So northeast should be around in this area, but I don't see it. Anyways, so he's not that far away. He goes to Nob, and what's important about Nob is the tabernacle is there. The tabernacle, as you remember, is the precursor to the temple. It is the place where God is. So he has a band of people with him. He's been gathering these people now, and these are kind of scallywags. These are people who, owe money. They are mercenaries. They're murderers. But they're people who he's kind of gathering around him, and they hear that he's out and about, and they've heard the stories of all the things that David has done, so they're following him. Probably some of his men who had followed him during those campaigns, they're following him as well to kind of be with him. Well, he comes to Nob, to the priest there, and he says, "Do you have anything to eat for me?" And the priest says, "Well, we have the holy bread. We have the bread of the presence." Now, this was the bread that was always to be on the table. And it was fresh baked fairly regularly, but it was only for the priest. And the priest says, "Well, we have the holy bread of the holy presence. It's only for the priests. Are your men clean? Are your men, have they not engaged in sexual activity recently?" He says to the priest, whether it's true or not, he says, "Yeah, oh, absolutely. We remain pure when we're on campaign." And there's some suggestion that this is in fact how David went on campaign, is he was very strict as far as the code, even with these kind of scallywag people, because he's trying to teach them. He's trying to help them to understand. But anyways, he says to the priest, "Yes, they're ritually clean, no problem." So the priest says, "Okay, here." He gives him the bread. And David says, "Well, do you have any weapons?" Because I'm on a mission from Saul. Saul sent me on a mission. Now, this is definitely, he's lying, right? But I forgot to bring my sword. Again, it's very rare to have a sword during these times, because the Philistines don't allow them to have blacksmiths. "Do you have any swords? Do you have anything?" And the priest says, "Well, we've got the sword of Goliath here." And David's like, "Okay, I'll take that." And he takes the sword of Goliath, right? So now he's walking around with this like claymore type thing, right? Giant sword. Great, awesome. So they leave. Word gets out to Saul that the priest of Nob helped David. And he goes and he slaughters the camp. Every priest that is at Nob at that point slaughtered, because they helped David. This will go with David all of his life. He will grieve the fact that these guys died because they helped him. He had nothing to do with it, but it was his fault, right? So there are some songs, there are some indications that this really sticks with him. This makes it very clear beyond anything else, this is who my enemy is. This is the guy who has set himself against me, is the man who's willing to just slaughter priests. That's who he is. During this time, he also kind of makes an alliance. It will be a stronger alliance, but with the king of Gath, who's a Philistine. He kind of semi-aligns himself with the king of Gath, and during this time, kind of Hamlet style, he pretends that he's crazy, so that the king of Kish of Gath doesn't actually kill him, but he kind of semi-comes under the Philistines' protection, so he can try to elude Saul. During this time also, he is spending most of his time here in the caves of Adullam. And here, down here, it's probably 20 miles away from Gibeon, but this is not very far from Bethlehem. This is a place that he knows for whatever reason. It's this cave system. It's really complicated, so he's able to hide these people who keep kind of coming to him. And I'll read that bit real quick before we finish. David left there and escaped to the cave of Adullam, where when his brothers and all of his father's house heard of it, they went down to him. So again, remember the brothers who, last time we heard, were like, "What are you doing, you little punk?" They've heard all of this stuff, and now they're going to side with him. Everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Those who were with him numbered about 400 at this point. So he's there, and this is for a while. He writes a lot of songs during this time, and he trains these men in the ways of God. He teaches them to sing, he teaches them to fight, he teaches them about God's Spirit and God's covering. During this time, this sort of ragtag group that just kind of appears and gathers around him, these eventually will become this group called the Mighty Men of David. These are men who are fierce on the battlefield, but also fierce, they are men. They're men. And all of the good that goes along with that, right? At some point, they will be called a wall for the people. They are a protection. They are the people, this is where they're learning, from being debtors and murderers and mercenaries and disaffected and all these sort of they just don't quite fit with society. Now they become these like pillars of society. So this is an important part for David because he's, again, learning leadership. He's learning a lot about himself. He's out in the wilderness. And think how important wilderness is in the life of God's people. God always puts his people out into the wilderness. Go learn. Go grow. Be in a place where you have to depend on me. Because only when we're in that place do we really actually truly learn to trust him. I'm working on there's going to be a blog post about biblical vacations this week. So that's where we're going to kind of leave that. David is eluding Saul in the wilderness. It's kind of going through this pattern of somebody, usually one of these other kind of tribes that are kind of associated with Israel, will go and tell Saul, "Hey, guess what? We saw David and he's in X place." So Saul goes and marches and tries to catch David, and David eludes him. And we just kind of go through this thing. So this is probably a long process, maybe even 10 years, something like that, where he's just constantly on the run. So that's where we're going to leave him. During this time, he has this friendship with Jonathan, which we're going to talk about next week. And that's a complicated but really fascinating and interesting part of David's life. So let's close in prayer. Lord God, thank you for this day. Thank you that you gather us to you. We're a bunch of misfits and a bunch of ragtag folks. You teach us how to trust you. You fill us with your Spirit. You send us out into the wilderness so that we may learn to trust you. Lord God, be with us as we worship together, as we seek to sing your prayers through the songs. Bless us as we learn to be your people. We pray these things in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. All right.
What were you saying?
Put a little hot.
Hot.
How many times have we read